Hello, hello, lovely to have you here. What I want to be discussing today is what are called the 5 higher fetters. This is a part of a discussion of the 10 fetters of Buddhism. I did a discussion on the 5 lower fetters in my last video. I'll leave a link to that down below in the notes if you haven't seen it. You don't have to see that video to see this one. This is about 5 different fetters. Now, what are fetters? Well, just to reiterate that, fetters are habits of mind, things that we tend to involve ourselves in that keep us attached to the world, attached to suffering. They're the sorts of things that reduce our freedom in a certain sense. And along that same route, I should say, that path, the fetters illustrate the way that in early Buddhism, practice was a path. It involved progress. Progress from a position of a beginner not knowing very much to somebody who is very, very advanced. And so, as we might expect, the 5 lower fetters are earlier along the path. They're somewhat easier to overcome. They're the kinds of things that we overcome first. The 5 higher fetters, however, are more advanced. And it's good to know that before we get into this discussion, to realize that what I'm going to be discussing today are 5 habits of mind that are more subtle, more deeply ingrained into our approach to the world. They're also somewhat more esoteric in a certain sense. We'll get to that. Now, it's understood in the early tradition that these 5 higher fetters I'm going to be discussing today are not overcome until we reach enlightenment. That is to say that essentially all of us, all unenlightened beings, will display all 5 of these fetters to one extent or another. And so we should also keep that in mind. That is to say, these are not easy to overcome. These are not the kinds of things we should expect ourselves to have an easy time with. Now, the first 2 of these higher fetters may seem to us particularly esoteric. That is, they're called the desire for form and the desire for formlessness. That's literally what they say. That's how they're described. But what does that mean? Well, to understand these better, it's important to keep in mind that the advanced practitioner will generally have a very deep understanding of and practice with what are called deep states of meditative absorption. That is, deep states of meditation that are somewhat esoteric in their own right. There are 2 groups of these meditations in early Buddhism, at least most important ones. One group is called the jhanas, and another group are called the formless attainments. The jhanas, so it's said, are somewhat bound up in a sense of our body, in a sense of form. Form in a Buddhist context is a technical term, basically referring to our bodies in some sense. And so when we're in jhanic meditation, these deep states of jhanic absorption, there is some residual sense of the body involved. Exactly what that sense is somewhat controversial. I've done a number of videos on these topics and the topics of jhana and the formless attainments. Again, I'll leave links to those videos down below in the notes. There's a lot to go into. All we need to know for the purposes of this video, however, is that we have these jhanas, which are known as sort of form attainments, if you like, in a sense, and the formless attainments. Now, the formless attainments were deeper states of meditative absorption. And the Buddha rarely had anything really bad to say about any of these deep states of absorption, either the jhanas or the formless attainments. They weren't enlightenment, that's for sure. They weren't nirvana. But that aside, he felt that they were very useful kinds of practices. He himself, the Buddha himself, is said that he used to spend a long time in these states as pleasant abidings here and now. That was the kind of description that he gave of them. That is to say, they were nice, pleasant ways to spend one's time. But it's clear from these first 2 higher fetters that advanced practitioners could get attached to these states in various ways. That is to say, they could have a wish to remain in such states because of their pleasant nature, at least in one understanding or another of pleasant. This is another complex issue here, but I think we know what we're talking about, that these are states that one wants to stay in. And in the Buddhist understanding, the traditional Buddhist understanding, any attachment to a kind of mental state will tend to lead to rebirth in that state in a future life. So these first two higher fetters can be understood as a desire for rebirth in the realms that are associated with each of these kinds of meditations. That is, a desire for rebirth in the form realms, these realms of sometimes what are called luminous form, or a desire for rebirth in the formless realms, which are yet higher. All of these are sort of heavens, basically, that one is said to remain in for long periods of time. Now, these can also be understood simply as, or more simply as, a tendency, a mental tendency, to grasp at such states, to identify with either with the state itself, feeling that that is who we really are, that that's revelatory of who we really are when we're in that state, or that we want to, again, remain there, that we, again, identify with it in some sense. And so in that more metaphorical sense, we are reborn or wish to be reborn as a person of those kinds of states, of those kinds of mental operations. Now, if we're talking about the traditional understanding of literal rebirth into one of these kinds of realms, these are, again, sort of heaven realms that traditionally one is said to remain in for many eons if one is reborn there. However, after a period of time in either the form realms or the formless realms, one would eventually die and be reborn elsewhere, probably in a lower realm. And so these realms, these higher realms of meditative absorption, are part of samsara. They're not part of nirvana. They're not the final goal. They're not the escape from the world of birth and rebirth and death. And as a result, they're not what we're looking for. And that's one of the ways that these are fetters, that these mental operations keep us attached to the world. Our desire for the experience of jhana, or a desire for the experience of formless meditations, even if we don't have them ourselves, I think we can understand that, sometimes you get into a meditative state that is particularly deep and that's very pleasant, and you have a desire to remain there. Well, that's a worldly desire. That's a fetter of a kind. Now, the third of these higher fetters is known as conceit, which is a very sort of subtle sort of state of mind, a kind of an ego, the subtle way that the ego can manifest itself in somebody far along the path. Although, to be perfectly fair, conceit is something that we all share. In other words, even those of us very far from being advanced will have conceit come up in the mind from time to time. This is also known in early Buddhism as a comparing mind. That is to say, it is said that there are three forms of conceit. There is the conceit that we feel that we're better than other people. That is perhaps the one we think of most often. However, there are also two other forms. There's the form of conceit that says that we're worse than other people, and there's the form of conceit that says that we're equal to other people. All of these are seen as problems in early Buddhism. That is to say, that they involve a reification, a sort of a solidification around our sense of self. That is, it's a sense, some subtle sense that there is a permanent nature to who we are, and that nature is better than the natures of other people in some fundamental way, or worse, or the same. Now, it's important to keep in mind that even an enlightened person can indeed make comparisons of these kinds. Indeed, the Buddha did so all the time. So what's the difference? What's the difference between an enlightened person making a comparison of being better or worse in certain respects and conceit? Well, the difference is that conceit involves an emotional attachment to that comparison. That is to say, at least we should understand it this way, that when an enlightened person like the Buddha makes a comparison like this, there's no emotional attachment to it. In other words, if they say, I am better at this, the Buddha often said he was very good at certain things, and someone disagrees, there's not going to be any emotional pushback. There's simply going to be an acknowledgement that this is either true or false in this particular case. Whereas for most of us, I submit, the whole point of making these kinds of conceited comparisons is that we're emotionally invested in them. If somebody attacks our feeling of superiority, we feel personally attacked by it. We take it personally. If somebody says that we're not all equal, or that we're not worse than somebody else, that may make us thrilled, let's say, or in the case that we're somebody's saying we're not worse than somebody else. Or if they're saying that we're not equal to, depending on the case, that can make us feel either angry or really happy, depending on the case. So all of these are examples of emotional investment in the comparison. And I would submit that's the difference here. That's what makes something conceit, as opposed to a simple comparison of no particular importance. Now, the fourth of these higher fetters is called restlessness. Now, this is a strange one. It seems to be related to the mental hindrance that hinders us from attaining meditation, known as restlessness and remorse. Now, to be honest, I've heard people arguing both sides of this issue. By the way, I should say that the hindrances are 5 different mental operations, mental tendencies, that make meditation difficult for us, and indeed make life difficult for us in many ways. I've done videos about the hindrances, and I'll leave a link to those down below in the notes if you're not familiar with them. But as I say, one of the standard hindrances is called restlessness and remorse, and this fourth higher fetter sounds to me like one of these hindrances, the restlessness part of restlessness and remorse. And again, I've heard people argue both sides. I've heard some very eminent scholar meditators say that this is the same, indeed, and that this hindrance of restlessness doesn't really, therefore, totally disappear until we become enlightened. And others I've heard say, no, these are completely different things. I'll leave that one up to you to decide. But in any event, the idea, I think, of restlessness here is this kind of very deep residual sense of unease and searching, that we're never quite satisfied, that we're always looking for things to cling to, things to identify with. So there's always this sense of residual unease. That, I think, is that restlessness. And of course, when we're just starting out, as I consider myself to be, and I'm sure you may as well, maybe you don't, but in any event, as we start out, this restlessness is very obvious to us. It's with us every day and all the time. We're always looking for things to cling to, always looking for things to hold on to or identify with. As we get farther along the path, of course, this restlessness will tend to diminish, and indeed when we're in deep meditation it may go away completely, but that's only for a time. That's important to realize, is that while restlessness and all of these states may not be completely present, nevertheless they remain as kind of what are known in Buddhism as latent tendencies of a sort. Now, the fifth and last of these higher fetters is what we might call the mother of all fetters, that is, ignorance itself. Ignorance is a lack of insight, it's a lack of wisdom. In some way, ignorance sort of encompasses all of the fetters, encompasses all of the negative states in one package. That is to say, it encompasses all the ones we've discussed, as well as perhaps other ones that we haven't. It is the way that all things begin in Buddhism, all bad things. Indeed, it is the origin, the eventual origin of suffering, of dukkha. In the most famous example of the chain of what is called dependent origination, that chain begins with ignorance. That is to say, the Buddha talks about a chain of causation, a chain of dependency, leading up to dukkha, to our suffering. And the whole point of Buddhist practice is to find an end to that suffering. The whole point is to break that chain. And, of course, the most effective way to break the chain is to break it at the very first link, which is ignorance. Now, the chain of dependent origination itself is quite complex and is quite a large thing to tackle. I can't do it right here in this video, but I have done past videos about dependent origination, and I'll leave a link to one of those videos up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to see it again. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much for all of your help. If you're getting something out of these videos, consider lending a hand. Consider checking out my Patreon page, which is linked down below in the notes, where we have some fun things that I can give you in response for helping out the channel. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.